So welcome today. We're going to be talking about multiple intelligences. My name is Christina McGrath. My company is Swell Fit Living, and I do nutrition optimization, and I help people with movement. I do personal coaching and every way to optimize your body and your mind, which is really exciting. And Charles?
Yeah, so good evening again, everybody. Lovely to see you all. So I'm Charles Leon, the same as I was last week. Haven't changed yet. So former or still designer and speaker and blogger, and I like to think perhaps thinker occasionally. At least I think occasionally. I think everybody thinks, but anyway. So today what we're going to look at is what we've called multiple intelligences. I'm not sure that that's the best possible title, but it sort of covers everything because it's multiple. But what I do want to look at today is what intelligence actually means, and what IQ tests actually measure, and why we want them to measure. Because there's a very odd thing with intelligence. We attribute certain sort of qualities and certain features to intelligence, but actually I'm not sure that we've got it right. And I think also that there is undoubtedly, as Christina and I were talking about just half an hour ago, there is a cultural shift in what intelligence means. So I think the problem with intelligence that we, as with most things, is that we love to have something we can measure. And, this has been a problem in schools, I think, is that rather than trusting any sort of intuition or any knowledge, we tend to want to measure. And the reason that we want to measure is we want the result. And that absolves us of the responsibility of actually thinking about or intuiting about what we want to do. So that's why I think IQ tests have really been developed. But I don't think that they really measure intelligence, because I don't think they tell us what intelligence is. They tell us what they can measure. And I think that's always been a problem. And because the things that it's measuring are not what we might perceive as being intelligent. It's much, much more than that. Now, just a note about testing intelligence and that sort of relationship is if you prime people first, then you will get a different result. Now, this has been proven in a lot of scientific research, or good research, I should say, where they have primed people to with various stereotypes. Stereotypes become very important in intelligence testing, and we'll come to that a bit later. But what they found is that if you prime somebody with potentially a racial stereotype, a gender stereotype, or any kind of stereotype, that will affect their performance, and they will perform accordingly. Now, it might be that they rail against it and do the opposite. But if you tell someone that, and please don't, it's not me speaking here, but if you tell someone that, well, women are nowhere near as intelligent as men, there is a fair chance that they will not do as well as they might have done if you'd have told them that women are far superior to men in terms of sort of doing tests or passing or being able to measure their intelligence. And there's a good reason why this happens. It's all to do with stereotyping. And our minds, our brains have to stereotype and have to chunk things into smaller bite-sized pieces. Because if we don't, we have to rethink it every time, and that's huge amounts of effort. We've spoken about this many, many times, is the brain consumes vast amounts of energy, vast amounts of oxygen, and as a result, it looks for quick ways to do things. So what we do, and science works in the same way, taxonomies work in the same way, is that you chunk things down so that you can actually deal with them in bite-sized pieces. You don't have to rethink the whole thing every single time. So to some extent, that's what's happened a bit with intelligence testing, is that it gets chunked. So if you've got 150 IQ, you must be a genius and must be useful and must be a great member of society. If you've only got an IQ of sort of 40 or 60, then perhaps we don't really need to invest too much time or effort into you. What I think the problem is, and we'll come to it again and again in this, is that intelligence isn't one thing, and it isn't necessarily measurable in the way that intelligence tests measure. So that's why we get false reasoning, false results, and stereotyping as well. And the stereotyping, as with many, many things like this, becomes self-fulfilling prophecies, is that if you categorize things, then people find themselves sitting into categories, and they will get into those categories and will see themselves in that way. So we do behave according to a self-image. So I've got a few definitions for you. There's a lot of different definitions of what intelligence is, and it's always a good place to start with a definition. And I'm going to run through some of them because some of them are highly influential in terms of how intelligence is measured nowadays. So Alfred Binet, who we'll come to in a moment, is one of the great founders of testing and intelligence testing. He says it's otherwise called good sense or practical sense. Now, that's not what he actually developed, but that's his definition. Another one is an aggregate or global capacity of the individual to act purposefully. Well, that would sort of encompass anyone from an entrepreneur to a sportsman to anybody who has an intent and acts on that intent and achieves that action. Another one is, and I don't quite know how this one sort of fits in, is the result of a process of acquiring and storing memory, retrieving, combining, and comparing. The comparing I understand, and using it in new contexts. That sounds almost like a description of creativity. Howard Gardner, who we will come to in a bit more detail and depth, calls it problem solving. And I think that gets very close to a good global definition of what intelligence is or might be, because problem solving and creative problem solving and creativity, I think, is completely inexorably linked with intelligence. In fact, I'd almost say that creativity is a synonym for intelligence, but it may be a different kind of intelligence. Partly because creativity is finding different solutions or new solutions to problems. So problem solving, I think, is very, very close to a definition that we can work with. So Linda Gottfredson has called it cognitive complexity, which I think is completely and utterly wrong. It's not cognitive complexity, because anyone can make anything complex. The difficulty is to make things simple and to simplify. Goal-directed, there's also a theory of structural cognitive modifiability, which I'm not going to go into tonight because I don't even understand it, so it doesn't really matter. Another couple who are quite sort of famous in cognitive research, Legg and Hutter, they talk about a synthesis of 70 plus definitions from psychology. That sort of makes sense too, and that's probably where we're going to end up going. And then Alexander Wisner-Gross says intelligence is a force, which is interesting because he actually comes up with an algebraic formula for intelligence, which baffles me, which is F equals T to the VS. Yeah, well, maybe. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. So it comes to this thing is who defines intelligence, and therefore the process of intelligence, which leads to potentially, I think, success or not. And it's this whole process of who can define something like intelligence. And I think it is purpose-driven. People define intelligence by the result they want. And that's why we have intelligence testing, is because people want more engineers, or they want more architects, or nobody wants more architects, actually, forget that. Nobody in the world wants more architects. There are too many of them anyway. But they may want more mathematicians or chemists or whatever it may be. And therefore we measure and we test for that, because that's the result that we want. And that then produces a self-fulfilling prophecy. It produces success. So in terms of looking at, say, for instance, again, Christina and I were talking about this, about what are the cognitive processes of intelligence. And without any doubt, which none of them really deal with in terms of their definitions of intelligence or their testing of intelligence, is learning, is one of the main sort of tenets of the cognitive process, which none of them really sort of deal with, certainly in testing and certainly in terms of sort of dealing with intelligence and forming concepts. Now, conceptualization is a very, very, very high level skill, I think. And that involves the synthesis of all sorts of information and in and out information as well. Reasoning as well, which uses a different type of thinking, of course, and understanding. Now, the other thing that we come to, particularly, I don't know what you think about this, Christine, is about pattern recognition. And we were certainly talking about pattern recognition in terms of sort of forming habits. Again, you have to form habits in order to save yourself time and energy. But pattern recognition is one of the things that IQ tests check or test. But pattern recognition, I think, has a much deeper meaning, which is basically how we create and develop stories. So we see sort of repeated events, and when we see repeated events, we give them a meaning because we think we can predict the future. And that also is a form of intelligence and a cognitive process. And innovation and planning as well, cognitive processes that are essential and quintessential to intelligence, we think. And solving problems, I come back to that same sort of thing about solving problems is a measure, I think a very good measure of intelligence. But the problems that might need solving are not necessarily mathematical or verbal or even cognitive in that sense.
And I think what you and I were coming to is that obviously, and like you just talked about at the beginning, is that whatever you're testing the intelligence for has to be specific. Like, I think what's kind of gone interesting is that when there's a general idea of general intelligence, and this goes back to your idea of this paradigm shift and that cultural possibly intelligence will be coming up in the future. And I think that will lead or have be defined by all these cognitive processes and how we learn and recognize patterns and have curiosity and develop creative innovations in order to move forward.
Exactly, absolutely. And the other correlate that goes with it is, of course, communication and language skills as well, which do become important, but are not. I think there's a difference between necessary and specific. So communication and language skills are necessary, but not they're not specific to intelligence. So they're something that could be, but not necessarily.
And they could, also, depending on what you're wanting, this goes back to measure for what you want. In certain areas, they're almost irrelevant. However,
so here's a stupid question: is that someone who is very aware of their body, as in a sportsman or someone like that, that is surely a form of intelligence, I think.
Well, yeah.
I mean,
it's huge. And it's not to say, I mean, like you and I were talking about, it's the intelligence is different. The proprioception is different. The ability to recognize patterns for football players, their ability to recognize a pattern is a certain kind of intelligence.
And a kinesthetic.
Yeah, kinesiology. Yeah. And then also how their body adapts and performs. It's almost a science, but they know it's a specific kind of intelligence.
So let me go. I'm going to run you just quite quickly up to roughly now what's being used now, and historically anyway. It's sort of started. I mean, intelligence has always been around, of course, but testing of intelligence sort of started with Francis Galton in about 1882, and basically what he wanted was to do with the school system. Was in order to have a statistical method of understanding how people are doing. So it was just basically to measure people. Now that got taken up by two behavioral sort of the time behavioral psychologists who wanted to measure mental age, and that was Binet Simon, and they developed a test, and that is the foundations of the IQ test. That's where it all sort of really started, obviously with Francis Galton in terms of statistically analyzing results, and then it became the Binet Simon test, which then was, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, why did they want to come up with this in the first place?
They wanted, and this is a bit irritating. They wanted to measure people's mental age.
Okay.
That was their basic tenet, was to find out whether people, in terms of the actual age that they'd lived and their years, were actually of a mental age for that. And also, again, back into schools and universities, were they of the right mental age? Now, in about 1904, that got picked up by Charles Spearman, who then added to it to become a sort of a general factor for abstract reasoning. Now we're getting into stronger realms of employment, so this is where the cultural shift, I think, starts to happen. And again, these sorts of testing become the self-fulfilling prophecy, because once you have the test, then you can start categorizing people, and therefore you can start filtering people, which we'll come to the Myers-Briggs in a minute, where you start filtering types of people into certain categories so that you can employ them, basically, or assess them in some way, shape, or form. So after Spearman, we get the Cattell, Horn, Carroll, who are three psychologists, and they've boiled it down into two key factors that then break down into a further 8 categories. So the first is fluid intelligence, which is all about reasoning and concepts. And the second is crystallized intelligence, which is acquired knowledge. So this splits it into 2 parts: reasoning and concepts and the manipulation of all of that, and then the acquired knowledge and, again, the manipulation of all of that. And that then subcategorizes in terms of intelligence from, if you think fluid and you think crystallized, then you have what they call quantitative reasoning and reading or writing ability, and these are all subcategories of these other 2 lead categories, being fluid and crystallized. Short-term memory, they felt, was a good measure of how people are able and capable of processing information. And then into long-term and storage and retrieval as well. So you've got the short-term in the one hand, which is your sort of short-term memory, and then the second part of that is, of course, the longer-term memory, where you're storing information and then being able to retrieve it as a measure of intelligence as well. So they began to test this, including visual processing as well, and then auditory processing. Now, this is basically, apart from auditory, this is the IQ test. So we've got ourselves all the way up to the IQ test. And then they measured something called processing speed, which was your ability to think and react quickly, but in productive ways. So again, the cultural shift still continues, because now we're looking for people who have got specific types of skills that we can specifically employ and specifically use. And then it comes into the GT, because they have a big G and a little g, so decision, reaction time, and speed as well. Now that does relate to physical intelligence as well, because that's part of it. And this incredible ability, I mean, if in a baseball match, someone sort of hits for a home run and he's going to get caught, let's say, so it won't be a home run, obviously, then the calculation that has to go into the trajectory of the ball to the hand is quite phenomenal. And there's a lot of studies on how complex the trajectory and the ability to intercept the trajectory and to catch, which is a form of intelligence. Now, all that sort of leads down into why do we need testing? And then we get Myers-Briggs. And Myers-Briggs basically took Jungian philosophy and principles and boiled it down into a type test, what they call the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which I'm sure many, many, many people have taken. I've got, actually, I can put on the screen a little diagram which may help. It's sort of complex, but actually becomes, it makes an enormous amount of sense to me. And I haven't been a big fan of Myers-Briggs, partly because I say to myself, I don't want to get categorized into anything, so how dare they? But what it does is it breaks it down into 4 key principles, which are sensation, intuition, feeling, and thinking, and then breaks that further down into 4 categories, which are introversion and extroversion. So, and sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, judging and perception. Now, if the best way to imagine it, which I should have really done a drawing, and I will do a sketch or a diagram, which I will send out with the replay, is if you imagine that there are 4 quadrants, and in each of those quadrants is sensation, intuition, feeling, and thinking, and then crossing those both vertically and horizontally are introversion and extroversion, which are sort of like a balancing scale that influence how much or how little of the 4 main categories, 4 main principles. And then you've got sensing and intuition, thinking and feeling, and then judging and perception. Now, that leads to this very complicated looking diagram. It's not quite as complicated as it looks. And once you get your head around those sort of 8 basic categories, you start to find, of course, that there are the 16 possibilities that come out of that. And these are basically the Myers-Briggs personality types or type indicators. And to some extent, this all goes down to, comes back to, I should say, to Jung's stereotypes and types. And it begins to make quite a lot of sense. There is, which I'm just going to stop sharing that for a second, there is this other book, which perhaps I'll sort of leave a link to, which is Why Can't Other People Be More Like Me, which does exactly that, but breaks it down, if I can just quickly show you, into colours. Now, the colours don't necessarily mean anything, but they are associative. And that sort of helps. Again, it's categorizing things. When you categorize things, you allow yourself to associate other things to it and to use that information into other situations, which is very much how the brain works.
So I just wanted to interrupt just for a second. For the 2 things about the Myers-Briggs and just what we were talking about with the personality quizzes, is I was talking to Charles earlier, and in a lot of my leadership and training programs, whether I'm teaching them or somebody else is teaching them, we always talk about communication. And I've found that these type of personality tests not only identify my communication style and how I like to communicate and take in information, but allows me to understand how other people are going to take in the information that I give them if they're a different style. So I find that in leadership roles, it's great to understand, even though you're in a box, we've defined you as something. We all have different ways we'd like to communicate and take in information, and we learn and obviously are more, I guess you would say, intelligent with. And I find that to be very useful in these personality tests. It's
a sort of unfortunate truth, or uncomfortable truth, is that in order to think about anything, you have to categorize it.
Yeah.
You really deal with it in your mind unless you build it into a category.
And once
you built it into a category, that is, I mean, to some extent, that is also the foundation of stereotyping, of racism, of all sorts of other problems. But that's how our brains work. And that's the problem. And obviously, we're not going to talk about, well, not obviously, but we're not going to talk about racism and all of that right now. But it is, they are all very closely related. And I think there are reasons why people like to associate with like people.
Yeah.
So, and that's to do with how our brains actually categorize things. There's lots of other complex reasons. And fortunately, they can change, and they do change. We have plastic brains, and they can change. And culture does change those things.
And circumstances, like you just said, like I guess we were talking about earlier, is a paradigm shift. globally will all under the same kind of problem.
Yeah.
It's very interesting in that we're shifting ways we are taking in information in addition to thinking about things. The other thing I wanted to ask you actually about the Myers-Briggs is, do you think that you change throughout your life with this personality type?
Yeah. And I think that's one of the fundamental problems that, in fact, I'm really pleased you brought that up, because originally, and still to some extent, IQ tests tend to treat people as being of a particular level of IQ forever. That's it. You're branded. You might just as well stick your forehead, say, I'm an idiot, or I'm a genius, or whatever it is, because it brands people. And that's one of the big objections to it, I think, is because it categorizes people and doesn't realize that some people blossom and change at different times in their lives. I'm hoping it's still going to happen to me sometime, but I'm not quite there yet. But what's also interesting is that Myers-Briggs comes in sort of, 50s, 60s. Culture is changing. We're looking at different ways of assessing things. IQ tests, yeah, they do something, but they're not sort of feeding the right kind of industry and market. You've got Tom Peters and people like that writing in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, all changing how business sees itself. And this is beginning to change how we assess things. And that sort of immediately brings us on to the next big sort of paradigm shift, which is this whole thing about multiple intelligences. Now, that's about 1983. Howard Gardner brought out was a psychologist working to study what intelligence is all about, and he came up with the term that we've used as a title of this webinar, which is multiple intelligences. So we've arrived at multiple intelligences, but it hasn't stopped there. Of course, culture keeps moving on. And he breaks it down, and I think this is an intelligent breakdown. Now, he's come under a lot of academic criticism for this, because people say that it hasn't been properly control groups and all the rest. So the way he breaks it down is into basically 11 or 12 categories. It started out as, I think it was 11 or 8 first, and then gradually expanded in the second and third editions of his book. But this began to shift, I should say, everything. People then suddenly started thinking, well, IQ tests don't really deliver in that way, although they're still around. So his categories are musical, rhythmic, and a harmonic, which we haven't even begun to talk about, which isn't necessarily related to any type of problem solving or processing in that sense. And I suppose that the example of this would be someone, she must forgive me for mentioning her, is someone like Dame Madeline Jenney, who is completely tone deaf. Not tone deaf, she's stone deaf, stone deaf, and is one of the world's leading sort of percussive instrument players. And that's a different kind of intelligence. It can't be verbal, it can't be visual. So visual spatial is the second category, and that is tested in all categories that I've found completely and utterly. We've all done stupid IQ tests with, the little squares with the circle with the dot that's moving around, and then the line, and you have to put it all together. That's visual spatial understanding. And verbal linguistic, that's also often tested. And I think that's one of the main parameters that most people would assess somebody that they meet as being intelligent at the beginning. And I think when we meet people and they speak, they open their mouths, then we know very, very quickly whether we can engage with them. I won't say whether they're intelligent or not, but that's what I mean. And then logical and mathematical, which I think is a very, very specific skill and a very specific type of intelligence as well. But now we get to the newer categories, which is this bodily kinesthetic, which I know that Christina knows a lot more about than me. But it's this whole thing of being intelligent with your body and your space and your spatial awareness as well. And it's something that sports people develop, and it does change over time.
Yeah, and I think also with body kinesthetic, and it also, I think the cool thing is that it translates to different sports, because I have a lot of athletes that I start them with a yoga practice and they've never done it before. They know how to, they're great with how to move their body in space. And so it's a talent to know how to relax a certain muscle and how to engage a certain muscle at the same time.
You know that some soccer players, I'll say soccer, well, I mean football, but
yeah,
we call it football,
we know.
You call it.
We know what you mean.
But some of them were actually, I can't remember which team it was, but maybe somebody can remember, were taken to ballet training because of the need for that kind of fluidity and that kind of connective movement. So that's quite interesting. Yeah. So category 6 is interpersonal. Now, that we might call sort of emotional intelligence, and we'll come on to emotional intelligence in just a moment. And intrapersonal, so that means about yourself, really. So rather than you relating to other people, that is understanding someone else and their emotions, it's also about you understanding your own emotions. He has another category called naturalistic, which is actually related to nature. So understanding and being in tune with nature, he cites as being about how we exist, where we exist, and what existence means as well, which is, I think, possibly stretching it a little bit. But that then that gently shifts our emphasis into religion, spirituality, and all those sorts of things, which is also a different kind of intelligence.
Yeah, and you could say with naturalistic, it's like the people who are really like, if you're a green thumb, like if you know how to grow a garden, like that's an intelligence. Like I have a lot of friends that can definitely grow everything that they want to grow because they have a certain intuition with how nature works. So I find that to be fascinating because it is definitely a specific intelligence.
So the next one that we touched on very briefly earlier is pedagogic. So being able to teach. And the mirror image of that is being able to learn. Now, as far as I can see, none of the intelligence tests really really look at or assess, or none of the definitions even assess the ability to learn. You know, some people are capable of learning very quickly, very easily, and some people are not. And that must be another form of intelligence. And maybe it's a skill as well. I mean, that we'd have to really look into.
Yeah,
but this ability to teach, but the ability to teach is also considered by Howard Gardner as being an intelligence. And the one that I love, the one that I think is best of all, is humor. And humor is a really complex mental thing that we do. And a lot of it is to do with associations and breaking those associations and leading you in one direction and then suddenly changing direction. But he cites humor as a type of intelligence as well. So I don't know how anybody else feels about that, but I would agree that humor is very difficult to find and to do. And therefore, the difficulty suggests that it probably is a type of intelligence, a way of looking at the world. So we've got culture gently moving along now. We're now looking at multiple intelligences instead of one type of statistic, and then slightly more complex statistics and slightly more broader sense of what intelligence is. And then we get to Daniel Goleman, who then releases his book, Emotional Intelligence, which is a big game changer. Now, it's not that nobody was talking about emotional intelligence before, because they were, and they have been for years and years, well, centuries almost. But he really nailed it down, stopped it flapping around and being around the edges. But what's interesting is that emotions haven't really played much part in testing and in decision making. And suddenly somebody recognizes that this is a really, really powerful form of intelligence, and it gets swept up, particularly by business. So he sort of quotes emotional intelligence and emotional leadership, emotional quotient, and emotional intelligence quotient as a combination of the two. And I think that this is actually a big game changer. Now, some of the other stuff that he starts going into is about curiosity, which is also, I mean, that's, again, connected with learning and everything else, but empathy, the ability to understand other people and to empathize with their feelings. So he breaks it down into 4 abilities, which he calls perceiving, using, understanding, and managing. And these sort of abilities are the way that we use intelligence, and the intelligence are all the categories that we've gone before. So, but empathy is one of the, sorry.
I was going to say, like, kind of, we're talking about before, prior to the talk was that obviously emotional intelligence, once you're in your position or you're with a business, this is, I almost think, where the paradigm shift is coming, is that curiosity, empathy, and the 2 other ones he stressed was gratitude and pride. And that's basically how people learn and connect with others and stay with their jobs. And so they are kind of emotional intelligence that you can, that we were doing in a lot of our well-being programs.
Yeah. But
So,
what I find fascinating in all of this, having sort of looked at the research on all of this, is the way that culture has shifted its understanding and its needs for intelligence of different kinds. You know, it was the case that you needed statistical intelligence first, and then it became sort of slightly more in-depth, slightly more complex with spatial awareness and all the rest. And now we're sort of gradually sort of coming to, and then the sort of the summit of all of this at the moment is this thing called the Myers-Salovey-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test, which is shortened to MSCEIT. So there you go. Which is what they call, which I find fascinating, which they call emotionally based problem solving. Now, one of the really big discoveries or findings in neuroscience in the last 20 years or so has been the role that emotion plays in decision making. And that it used to be the case that everybody thought, right, you have to completely put all emotion to one side, and then you have to distill things down into logic and rationality, and that's how you decide. Well, that's not the case, and they know this because some people have had sort of serious brain damage in some various different ways, and that has damaged their ability to connect emotion with decision making. And what happens with some of these people who've had this type of brain damage, and it also happened, I think, with people who've had their corpus callosum cut in various sort of operations, is what happens is that they are incapable of making a decision. And that can be a tiny little thing like standing in front of the fridge and trying to work out what you want to eat is, well, mind you, we all have that problem.
I was just going to...
But the problem is that they can't see any value between any differences. So, you know, there is the same amount of value to a hamburger as there is to a clock. You know, they all have the same emotional value. So what they've realized is that emotions actually inform your decision making. They're not the one part, they're part of the part. But you can't decide without emotion. And that's why I think that the MSCEIT is a very, very interesting way to look at intelligence, because it's emotion-based problem solving. I haven't found yet a copy of their actual tests and what they actually test, but most of them, from what I've read, are about situational scenarios where they'll describe a situation and then you have to solve the problem. So this boils down into 5 basic categories, being self-awareness, so the ability to know your own emotions, your own strengths, your own weaknesses. I mean, this is what all sort of business literature at the moment is, and self-help literature is all about. It's all about emotions, strengths, weaknesses, drives, values, goals. That's what it is. And so, interestingly, that our definition by testing of intelligence has come to a very, very similar point as well. Then self-regulation is another very important part of it, and involves controlling and redirecting your disruptive emotions. So that also they're considering as an intelligence, and also redirecting impulses and adapting and changing to different circumstances. Social skills. So these are the first guys to really start talking about something that none of them have yet spoken about. So they've spoken about empathy, but not really about social skills. Now, if there is probably, according to recent sort of surveys or articles that I've read, social skills are one of the key factors of success. And I remember also when my son was little and was doing his very best to fail at school completely and utterly, we always said, oh, he'll be fine because he's got great social skills. And I think that's true. I think social skills are a very important form of intelligence, really. And that comes to reading other people, reading yourself in context of other people, and other people in context of you as well. So that's managing relationships. So, and, you know, a lot of self-help books are all about managing relationships, as opposed to Tinder or anything like that, which is not relationship. But anyway, I don't know anything about those, of course. Empathy is the next category that they have, and this links in with sort of self-awareness, self-regulation, and social skills as well, and understanding other people's feelings. Just as a slight aside, we all have what are called mirror neurons within our brains, which allow us to empathize with other people. So the classic example is, if you see a child get their finger caught in a door, you will wince in the same sort of way. You won't have the pain, but you will wince in the same sort of way that the child is sort of wincing or crying when you see that pain happening. So that's mirror neurons that we have in our brains actually do that. And the final category that they come to is motivation, is being aware of what motivates them and where they're going. And that's about goal setting. So again, you can see how, I don't know which came first, whether the definition of intelligence and testing and then the literature, but I suspect it's a sort of zeitgeist. Everything is sort of happening at a similar sort of time, because we've all reached the edge of this sort of, this possibility of things, by virtue of everything that's come up behind it and before it, so that we stand on the shoulders of giants, etc., etc. And then the final sort of step, I think, in all of this is what's now called psychometric testing. So this now is the newest brand, which is slightly tempered by political correctness, I have to say as well, but is based mostly on Jungian philosophy and studies. And psychometric testing is basically behavioral psychology. And interestingly, that this is even fed into, not quite psychometric testing, but we now have behavioral economics as well, by Kahneman as well. And this is looking at future behavior and performance, and what are the predictors of those things. So here we are, sort of very fast moving. The world is changing very quickly, and particularly at the moment, nobody knows. But psychometric testing is looking at behavioral psychology and then future behavior, which I find fascinating. So we've shifted completely from, you know, let's go and pick the supermarket. Well, it wasn't supermarket in those days, but let's go and pick what we want by the statistics that we've created, or by the IQ level, or by then eventually emotional intelligence. And now we get to something called behavioral psychology and psychometric testing, which is very, very different, which measures a whole range of things, but mostly based on sort of Jungian philosophy. So it's intelligence, ability, personality, and motivation. Interestingly now that motivation has come into two separate studies and categories. The MSCEIT studies and tests, and also now in psychometric testing is that motivation becomes important. And the other thing is that the next sort of shift within psychometric testing is ability and aptitude as well. And aptitude is something that looks forward, saying that, or it looks at the present capability of being able to look forward. So, and they will break this down, and again, that's in that lovely little book called "Why Can't More People Be More Like Me?" Critical reasoning, verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, abstract reasoning, mechanical reasoning, spatial reasoning that very few have talked about in terms of physical space rather than pattern space, and finally, business skills. So business skills are now considered to be an intelligence, which sort of makes sense in the world that we're in, is that, I think, I don't know if I'm right, but I think one of the sort of higher valued ways of being and existing in the world at the moment is to be an entrepreneur. That's it. That's somewhere up at the top. And to be a successful entrepreneur, even better, as opposed to a failed one, because they're not so good. So that's pretty much a sort of quick round. I don't think I've really sort of come to any conclusions about what intelligence is, except that it is a lot of different things. I think that's the main thing. But there is one category, and Christina and I were specifically talking about this, and we will do a webinar some point in the near future on this, is storytelling. I think storytelling is a very, very high cultural form of intelligence, and it involves pattern making, it involves thinking about the future, it involves synthesizing everything from the past. So I would put storytelling into the pot with emotions, with self-regulation, with empathy, motivation, and even business skills and all of that. So I think it's a multifaceted thing. And that's the thing that I've always objected to and railed against in IQ tests, and to some extent Myers-Briggs, is that it categorizes you. And I don't want to be categorized in that way. And I always feel a little bit offended by the categorization, because I think, no, I'm not that, I'm better than that, or I'm different from that. And don't we all do that? I mean, and that's, again, that's our intelligence saying, well, let's be something else. We don't have to be what we're stereotyped to be.
And I think the other thing that really is hitting the point after we went through the whole grand scheme of how we measure things is that we've come to a space where we really need to strengthen our strengths and learn more about our strengths. Before, there was a lot of like, let's get everything equal and let's kind of bring up our weaknesses and do that. But now I feel like now we're like, take our strengths and really learn how to amplify them as well.
See, I don't agree with that.
What do you, do you think we should keep? Do you think we should also work on our weaknesses?
Well, I think that given the right environment and circumstances, you can pretty much become anything, almost anything.
Oh yeah, I do agree.
So I think that one of the difficulties for children, particularly bringing up children, is that you tend to see that they have a talent, whatever that is, and that you tend to encourage them to make that talent, when actually you should probably be working, as you're saying, you should be working more on their weaknesses and making them whole and rounded. And that's one of my great criticisms of schools, is that they teach children what to think and not how to think. And I think
That's probably more of what I was getting at. But I do feel like that if you're mathematically or musically aware, that if you try to increase your business skills, that might not be the best avenue for you. That's
exactly
like what I was thinking.
Exactly. So that's it for this week.
There you go.
I hope that was interesting. Right, so that's it for this week. Thanks very much, everybody.
We'll see you next week. Thanks, Charles.
Yeah, see you all next week. See you. Good night.